Eleanor Voss stood in the cold auction hall with her heart pounding, watching the numbers climb higher than she had ever expected. The gavel had not fallen yet, and every second felt like it could break her plan into pieces. She gripped the paddle in her hand, knuckles pale, refusing to let anyone in the room see how much this moment mattered to her. The auctioneer called out the price again, faster now, his voice sharp and urgent. Across the room, a tall man, in a dark gray coat, raised his paddle without hesitation. He did not look nervous. He looked like a man who was used to winning, and used to being obeyed. Eleanor recognized him from the file she had studied for weeks. He worked for the Ashcombe family, sent to protect a property they claimed they no longer wanted, yet clearly still guarded like a secret. She raised her paddle again. The number climbed. The room grew quiet, sensing a battle that had turned personal. People stopped checking their phones and started watching the two competitors instead. Eleanor could feel her pulse in her throat, but she forced her voice steady when the auctioneer asked her to confirm her bid. "Confirmed," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The man in gray turned to glance at her for the first time. His eyes narrowed, studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then he leaned toward the agent beside him and whispered something. A moment later, he lowered his paddle. The room let out a breath it had been holding. The gavel came down. Sold, to bidder number 14. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of what she had just done settle into her chest. Ashcombe Manor, the abandoned estate on the edge of Grovewood Village, now belonged to her. She had waited for this moment longer than anyone in that room could imagine, though she had told no one the real reason why. As she stepped forward to sign the paperwork, the man in gray approached her with a stiff, formal posture. "You do understand what you have just purchased," he said. It was not a question. "I read the listing," Eleanor replied calmly. 12 acres, a manor house in disrepair, no working heating, and a reputation for scaring off buyers. I understand perfectly. The reputation is not exaggeration, he said. Duke Ashcombe wanted you to know that before you sign. Eleanor blinked in surprise. The Duke sent you here to talk me out of buying his own house? He sent me here to observe, the man said. He did not expect anyone serious to actually win the bid. Something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach tighten, but she refused to show it. She signed the final line on the document, her handwriting steady despite the storm building inside her. "Tell your employer," she said, "that I am very serious." The man studied her a moment longer, then gave a small nod and walked away, already dialing a number on his phone. Eleanor did not know it yet, but by the time she reached her car outside the auction house, Duke Reginald Ashcombe already knew every detail about the stranger who had bought the one place he swore he would never sell. She drove out of the city as the afternoon light began to fade, following the narrow road that wound through hills and bare autumn trees toward Grovewood. The GPS lost signal twice, forcing her to rely on an old paper map she had printed the night before. She did not mind. She had been preparing for this drive for a long time, rehearsing it in her mind more times than she could count. The village itself was small, with a single main street, a stone church, and a row of shops that looked like they had not changed in 50 years. A woman named Margaret Doyle stood outside the grocery store, sweeping the front step, and looked up as Eleanor's car passed. Margaret's eyes followed the car with open curiosity, the kind reserved for strangers in towns where everyone already knew each other. Eleanor parked near the edge of the village to ask for directions, since her map had grown difficult to read in the dimming light. Margaret approached before she could even ask. "You're the one who bought the manor," Margaret said, not unkindly, but with clear surprise. "News travels fast around here." "Word must travel very fast," Eleanor said, forcing a small smile. "I only signed the papers 3 hours ago. The lawyer's office called the church secretary, who called my sister, who called me," Margaret explained with a shrug, as if this were the most natural chain of communication in the world. "You're really planning to live there, alone?" "I am." Margaret's expression shifted into something between concern and disbelief. Ashcombe Manor has been empty for 11 years. No one goes near it after dark. Even the postman refuses to deliver past the gate. "I'm not superstitious," Eleanor said. "It's not about superstition," Margaret replied, lowering her voice. "It's about what happened to that family. Whatever chased them out of that house was real enough to make a duke abandon his own inheritance." Eleanor felt a chill, that had nothing to do with the evening air, but she kept her composure. "I appreciate the warning. I still need to find the road that leads up to it." Margaret gave her directions, then added one final piece of advice before Eleanor drove away. "If the Duke shows up at your door, don't dismiss him too quickly. He knows things about that house that no listing agent ever will." Eleanor thanked her and continued on, following the winding gravel road that climbed a low hill on the outskirts of the village. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. When the manor finally came into view, Eleanor slowed the car and simply stared through the windshield for a long moment. Ashcombe Manor was larger than the photos had suggested, a grand stone structure with tall windows, most of them cracked or boarded, and ivy climbing across half the front wall like it was trying to reclaim the building for the forest. 2 broken lion statues guarded the entrance, one missing its head entirely. The iron gate hung open on rusted hinges, creaking gently in the wind. It should have looked frightening. Instead, Eleanor felt something unexpected settle over her as she stepped out of the car and looked up at the towering house. It felt like recognition, like arriving somewhere she had already visited many times in her mind. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the folded photograph she had carried with her since childhood, the one she never let anyone see. She did not take it out yet. There would be time for that later, once she was alone inside. As Eleanor gathered her bags from the car, headlights appeared behind her on the gravel road. She turned to see an expensive black car pull up at the gate, engine idling, before the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and composed, dressed in a fitted charcoal coat that looked far too refined for a countryside road at dusk. Eleanor recognized his face immediately from the photographs in the estate file. Duke Reginald Ashcombe had come to see the woman who bought his family's ruin. He walked toward her with unhurried steps, his expression unreadable in the fading light. When he stopped a few feet away, his eyes moved briefly to the house behind her, before settling back on her face. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being listened to without argument. "I did not expect you to arrive so quickly." "I saw no reason to wait," Eleanor replied, matching his composure with her own. "It's my house now." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "It was my house first," he said quietly. "For 28 years, actually. Longer than you have likely been alive. And yet you sold it," Eleanor said. "Or rather, you let it be sold, since you didn't even attend your own auction." "I sent someone to watch," he said. "I wanted to see who would be foolish enough to buy it." Eleanor felt a spark of irritation rise in her chest, but she held it back. "I didn't realize buying property came with an insult included." "It wasn't meant as an insult," Reginald said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It was meant as truth. This house has broken every person who has tried to claim it since my family left. It will break you too." "You sound very certain." "I am certain," he said. "I've watched it happen. Contractors who quit within days. Buyers who backed out before signing. One family who lasted 3 nights before packing their car in the middle of a storm and never returning for their belongings." Eleanor crossed her arms, refusing to let his words shake her resolve. "And what exactly is supposed to break me? Bad plumbing? A leaking roof? I've handled worse in my life than a house that needs repairs." Reginald studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was brave or simply naive. "It's not the plumbing," he said finally. "It's the winter. It's the isolation. It's what this house does to people who stay too long inside it, alone, with nothing but silence and old memories that are not even their own." "That sounds like something out of a ghost story," Eleanor said, though her voice was quieter than she intended. "Call it whatever you like," Reginald replied. "I'll tell you now what I've told every owner before you. You will change your mind. You will regret this purchase before the first snow falls, and you will be begging to leave within a week." Eleanor felt something harden inside her, a resolve that had been building for years, long before she ever stepped foot in Grovewood. "I don't plead," she said evenly, "and I don't run from things that frighten other people." Reginald's jaw tightened slightly, though whether from anger or reluctant respect, Eleanor could not tell. "We'll see, Miss Voss," he said. "I hope for your sake that you are as strong as you believe yourself to be." He turned and walked back toward his car, without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone at the gate, as darkness settled fully over the hills. She watched his taillights disappear down the winding road, before turning back to face the manor rising silently before her. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters against the stone walls, and somewhere deep inside the house, something creaked like a slow, deliberate footstep. Eleanor took a steadying breath, lifted her bags, and walked through the broken gate toward the front door. Whatever waited inside, she was not leaving, not after everything it had taken her to get here, and not because of a warning from a man who did not yet understand why this house mattered to her more than he could possibly imagine. She pushed the heavy door open, and it groaned against its hinges, as if waking from a long sleep. Cold air rushed out to meet her, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something faintly like lavender that made her pause for just a moment before stepping inside. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, sealing her in with the shadows of a house that had waited 11 years for someone to return. Inside, the manor was darker than Eleanor expected, the last light of evening barely reaching through the grime-covered windows. She set her bags down near the entrance and pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket, sweeping the beam across a grand hallway lined with faded portraits and a staircase that curved upward into shadow. Dust covered every surface like a layer of forgotten time, and the air smelled of damp stone and something older, something she could not quite name. She moved carefully, testing each floorboard before trusting her full weight on it. In the sitting room, furniture sat draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes that seemed to watch her as she passed. A grandfather clock stood frozen at 3:17, its pendulum still, as though the entire house had simply stopped breathing the day the family left. Eleanor found the kitchen at the back of the house, surprisingly intact compared to the rest of the rooms. A cast-iron stove sat cold in the corner, and cobwebs stretched between cabinet handles like delicate curtains. She ran her flashlight along the counters until she found what she needed: an old oil lamp with just enough fuel left inside to cast a warm glow through the room. With the lamp lit, the kitchen looked less abandoned and more simply waiting, as if it understood that someone had finally come back to use it. Eleanor sat at the wooden table, exhaustion settling into her shoulders after the long drive and the tense confrontation at the gate. She thought about Reginald's warning, the certainty in his voice when he said she would beg to leave within a week. She refused to let his words plant fear inside her. Instead, she reached into her coat and finally pulled out the folded photograph she had carried for so many years. It showed a young woman, standing in front of this very manor, decades ago, her smile bright despite the worn dress she wore. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a single line: "This house was once a promise." Eleanor traced her fingers over the words, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that always came with this photograph. The woman in the picture was her grandmother, a woman who had worked in this house long before it belonged to the Ashcombe family, back when it had different owners entirely. Eleanor had grown up hearing stories about Ashcombe Manor, stories of a promise broken and a debt never repaid, though her grandmother had died before explaining the full truth. That unfinished story was the real reason Eleanor had spent years building her business, saving every spare coin, and finally bidding on this property the moment it appeared at auction. It was not simply real estate to her. It was the closing of a chapter that had haunted her family for 2 generations. She folded the photograph carefully and placed it back into her coat, determined to uncover the rest of the story, hidden somewhere within these walls. First, though, she needed to survive the night, and the temperature inside the house was already dropping fast as darkness fully claimed the sky outside. She explored further, searching for firewood or any working heat source, and eventually found a large fireplace in what must have once been a library. Shelves lined every wall, most of them empty or filled with warped, water-damaged books. A small stack of dry logs sat beside the hearth, as if someone had left them there recently, though the dust covering them suggested otherwise. Eleanor built a fire using matches from her emergency kit, grateful for the crackling warmth that slowly filled the room. She wrapped herself in a blanket she had brought from her car and settled into an old armchair near the flames, listening to the house creak and settle around her. Somewhere upstairs, she heard a soft thump, like something shifting in one of the empty rooms. She told herself it was simply the wind finding its way through a broken window, or an old structure adjusting to the changing temperature. Still, she kept the flashlight close beside her, its beam ready, in case the darkness decided to test her resolve. Hours passed as she drifted in and out of light sleep, the fire slowly burning down to embers. Around midnight, she woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps on the floor above her. Her heart pounded as she sat upright, straining to listen. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, crossing from one side of the ceiling to the other, before stopping completely. Eleanor grabbed the flashlight and stood, moving cautiously toward the staircase in the main hallway. Every instinct told her to investigate rather than hide, a trait that had served her well in business, but felt far riskier inside an abandoned manor at midnight. She climbed the stairs slowly, the wood groaning beneath her feet with each step. At the top of the staircase, a long hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors on either side. The air felt colder here, and her breath formed small clouds in the beam of her flashlight. She moved toward the door where she believed the footsteps had come from, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open to reveal an empty bedroom, furniture covered in sheets just like downstairs, undisturbed dust coating the floor in an unbroken layer. There were no footprints. There was no sign that anyone or anything had walked through this room in years. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, her pulse slowly returning to normal as she told herself it must have been an old branch scraping against the roof, or a shutter caught in the wind. She returned to the library and rebuilt the fire, refusing to let one strange noise shake the confidence she had worked so hard to build. Whatever secrets this house held, she intended to face them directly, rather than run from shadows and creaking floors. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the dusty windows, and Eleanor woke stiff and cold in the armchair, her blanket having slipped to the floor sometime during the night. She stretched and walked to the nearest window, wiping away a layer of grime to look outside at the estate grounds in daylight for the first time. The gardens, once clearly beautiful, had grown wild and overgrown, with weeds climbing through cracked stone pathways and a dry fountain sitting silent in the center of what must have been a courtyard. Beyond the gardens, the hills of Grovewood rolled toward the horizon, dotted with bare trees that would soon be covered in snow if the villagers' warnings about early winter proved true. Eleanor made a mental list of everything the house needed. New windows, roof repairs, a working heating system before the cold truly arrived. She had budgeted carefully for renovations, though she suspected the true cost would exceed even her most generous estimates once contractors saw the full extent of the damage. She spent the morning exploring room by room, documenting the condition of each space with photographs on her phone, though the signal was too weak to send anything or search for local repair services online. She would need to drive back into the village soon to make arrangements, but first, she wanted to see the rest of the house while daylight remained strong. On the second floor, she discovered a study that must have belonged to the head of the household at one point. A large wooden desk sat near the window, its surface covered in papers yellowed with age. Eleanor approached carefully, brushing dust away to reveal old letters and documents, some dated decades earlier than she expected. She sat down at the desk, despite the chill in the room, and began sorting through the papers, careful not to tear the fragile pages. Most were mundane records, household expenses and correspondence about repairs long since forgotten. But one letter, tucked beneath a stack of ledgers, caught her attention immediately. The handwriting matched the note on the back of her grandmother's photograph. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the letter closer to the window light. It was addressed to someone named Grace, and it spoke of a promise made between two families, a debt of gratitude that could never truly be repaid. The letter mentioned a young woman who had saved the household during a terrible illness that swept through the village decades ago, a woman whose kindness the family vowed never to forget. The letter was unfinished, cut off mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted and never returned to complete it. Eleanor searched the desk drawers for more pages but found nothing, only empty compartments and a single tarnished silver key that did not seem to match any lock she had seen in the house so far. She pocketed the key and the letter, her mind racing with questions. If her grandmother truly had a connection to this house beyond simple employment, what exactly had happened between the two families? And why had the Ashcombe family abandoned the manor so suddenly, if their history here was tied to gratitude rather than tragedy? She thought again of Reginald's warning at the gate, his insistence that something inside this house broke everyone who tried to stay. Perhaps the answer had nothing to do with curses or ghosts, and everything to do with buried secrets that someone in his family had worked very hard to keep hidden. Eleanor decided then that she would not simply restore this house. She would uncover its true history, no matter how long it took, or how many locked doors she needed to open along the way. She rose from the desk, tucking the letter safely into her coat, alongside the photograph, and continued her exploration with renewed determination. By afternoon, she had mapped most of the house's layout, noting which rooms needed the most urgent repairs. She found the estate's old caretaker cottage near the edge of the property, small but sturdy, and made a note to ask around the village about hiring local help. She would need someone who knew the house's history, someone the villagers trusted enough to speak with her openly. As she walked back toward the manor as the sun began to set behind the hills, Eleanor noticed a figure standing near the tree line at the edge of the property, watching her. By the time she raised her flashlight to get a better look, the figure had vanished into the shadows of the forest, leaving her standing alone in the wind, with more questions than answers, about the house she now called home. The next morning, Eleanor drove into Grovewood, determined to find help before the weather turned any colder. The village square was busier than it had been the day before, with a small market set up near the church, selling vegetables and fresh bread. She parked near Margaret's grocery store and stepped out, immediately drawing the attention of several villagers who paused their conversations to watch her walk by. Margaret waved her over with a friendly smile, though her eyes carried a hint of worry. "You survived the first night then," she said. "That's already more than most people expect." "It was cold," Eleanor admitted, "but I managed. I'm looking for someone who might help with repairs, someone who knows the house, if possible." Margaret considered this for a moment, before her expression brightened. "There's only one person in this village who worked at that manor before the family left, Henry Combs. He was the groundskeeper for the Ashcombs for nearly 20 years, though he hasn't set foot on that property since they departed. Do you think he would be willing to talk to me?" "He might," Margaret said carefully, "but I should warn you, he's not an easy man to convince. He watched that house fall apart from a distance, and it's clear it still weighs on him. If you want his help, you'll need to be patient." Margaret gave Eleanor directions to Henry's cottage on the far side of the village, near a small stream that cut through the fields. Eleanor thanked her and drove there directly, hoping to catch him before the day grew too late. Henry's cottage was small but well kept, with neat rows of vegetables growing in a garden beside the front door. When Eleanor knocked, an older man answered, his face weathered by years of outdoor work, his eyes sharp despite his age. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You're the one who bought the manor," he said, echoing Margaret's earlier words, almost exactly.
"I am," Eleanor said. "My name is Eleanor Voss. I was hoping you might be willing to help me with some repairs."
"Margaret mentioned you used to work there." Henry's expression tightened at the mention of the house, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might simply close the door. Instead, he sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in out of the cold. Inside, the cottage was warm and simple, filled with tools and old photographs that lined the walls. Eleanor noticed several pictures of the manor from decades earlier, back when its gardens were full and its windows gleamed in the sunlight. Henry noticed her looking and cleared his throat. "That house was beautiful once," he said quietly. "I spent the best years of my life keeping those gardens alive. Then everything fell apart, and I haven't been back since." "What happened?" Eleanor asked gently. "Everyone in the village talks about the house like it's cursed, but no one explains exactly what occurred." Henry was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in his small hearth. "There was an illness that swept through this village many years ago," he finally said. "It took several lives, including members of the Ashcombe household staff. The family nearly lost everything, including the young heir at the time, until a woman from outside the village came to care for them. She had knowledge of herbs and remedies that the local doctor did not possess, and she worked tirelessly, day and night, to save who she could." Eleanor's chest tightened as she listened, already suspecting where this story was headed. "Do you remember her name?" "Everyone called her Grace's friend," Henry said, "though I believe her real name was different. She never spoke much about herself. She simply worked, tending to the sick with a gentleness I've never forgotten. The family promised her everything in gratitude, a home, security, a place in their household for as long as she wished. but something happened before that promise could be honored. What happened? Eleanor pressed. Henry shook his head slowly. I was young at the time, working in the stables rather than the main house. I only know that she left suddenly, without explanation, and the family never spoke of her again. A few years after that, tragedy struck the family itself, and slowly, they drifted away from the house, until finally they abandoned it entirely. Some say the house holds on to that unfinished promise, refusing to let anyone new settle comfortably within its walls. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the pocket where she kept the photograph and letter. Henry, she said carefully, I believe that woman may have been my grandmother. Henry's eyes widened, and he studied her face with new intensity, as if searching for a resemblance he had somehow missed before. That would explain a great deal, he murmured. You have her eyes, now that you mention it. I remember them well, even after all these years. Eleanor pulled the photograph from her pocket and showed it to him. Henry took it with trembling hands, staring at the image for a long moment, before nodding slowly. Yes, he said softly, that's her. That's the woman who saved this village. I found a letter in the manor's study, Eleanor continued, addressed to someone named Grace, speaking of a promise and a debt that could never be repaid. It was unfinished. Do you know who Grace was? Henry's face grew somber. Grace was Reginald's mother, he said. She was the one who made that promise to your grandmother, back when Reginald himself was just a small child, saved from the very illness that nearly claimed his life. Eleanor sat back, absorbing this new piece of the puzzle. Reginald's own mother had made a promise to her grandmother, a promise that was somehow broken, leading to consequences that echoed through both families for decades. No wonder Reginald seemed so certain the house held on to old wounds. It did, though not in the way any of the village's superstitions suggested. Will you help me restore the house? Eleanor asked. Not just the repairs, but understanding what really happened. I think we both deserve to know the full truth. Henry considered her request for a long moment, glancing again at the photograph in his hands before finally nodding. I'll help you, he said. It's about time someone finished what was started all those years ago. But I must warn you, Reginald will not welcome this. He spent years avoiding the truth about his family's past. Digging it up now may not please him. I'm not trying to please him, Eleanor said firmly. I'm trying to honor a promise that was never kept. Henry smiled faintly, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since arriving. Then we understand each other perfectly. Give me until tomorrow to gather my tools and prepare. We have a great deal of work ahead of us, both on that house and in uncovering its history. Eleanor thanked him and returned to her car as the afternoon light began to fade once more. As she drove back toward the manor, her mind raced with everything Henry had revealed. The unfinished letter, the broken promise, Reginald's mother and her own grandmother, all connected by a debt that had somehow poisoned an entire family's relationship with their own home. She wondered how much Reginald actually knew about the true history behind his family's departure. Did he understand the real reason the house had fallen into ruin? Or had he simply inherited fear and superstition without ever learning the truth his own mother had tried to honor? Back at the manor, Eleanor spent the evening continuing her search through the study, looking for any additional letters or documents that might explain what happened after the unfinished note to Grace. She found nothing more that night, though she did discover an old ledger listing household staff wages, her grandmother's name appearing several times before disappearing from the records entirely around the same period Henry had described. As she worked by lamplight, she heard the same soft footsteps from the night before, this time moving along the hallway just outside the study door. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering the empty room she had found the previous night. She stood and opened the door slowly, flashlight raised. The hallway stretched empty before her, dust undisturbed on the floor. Yet this time, she noticed something she had missed before, a faint draft coming from beneath a section of wall paneling near the far end of the corridor. She approached carefully, running her fingers along the wood until she found a slight gap, barely visible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Behind the panel, hidden from view, was a narrow passage leading deeper into the house, dust thick along its edges, as though it had not been opened in many years. Eleanor stared into the darkness beyond, torn between exhaustion and overwhelming curiosity about what secrets might be waiting inside. She decided the passage could wait until morning, when she would have full daylight and Henry's help to explore it properly. For now, she closed the panel carefully, marking its location in her mind, and returned to the study to finish organizing the documents she had found. Whatever secrets this house still held, she was closer than ever to uncovering them, and she intended to see the truth through to its very end, no matter what Reginald or anyone else in Grovewood tried to tell her about the dangers of digging too deep into the past. Henry arrived at the manor early the next morning, carrying a bag of tools and a lantern with a fresh supply of oil. Eleanor met him at the front door, relieved to see a familiar face after another night spent alone in the creaking house. She led him straight to the hidden passage on the second floor, explaining what she had discovered the evening before. Henry examined the gap in the paneling with a furrowed brow. "I never knew this was here," he admitted, "and I spent 20 years working in this house. Whatever is behind this wall, someone wanted it kept secret from everyone, including the staff. They worked together to widen the opening enough to pass through comfortably, careful not to damage the old wood any more than necessary. The passage beyond was narrow and cold, the air stale from years of being sealed away. Eleanor's flashlight beam revealed a set of stone steps leading downward, deeper than she expected for a passage hidden on the second floor. "This must lead down toward the old cellar," Henry said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "There were rumors among the staff of tunnels beneath the house, though I always assumed they were simply stories meant to entertain children." They descended carefully, testing each step before trusting their full weight. The passage eventually opened into a small stone room, empty except for a single wooden trunk sitting against the far wall, undisturbed by time, in a way that suggested the room had been perfectly sealed from moisture and pests alike. Eleanor knelt before the trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she worked the rusted latch. Henry held the lantern closer, casting warm light across the lid as it finally creaked open. Inside, they found a collection of personal belongings, clothing carefully folded, a small wooden box, and a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. Eleanor lifted the letters first, recognizing the same handwriting from the unfinished note she had found in the study. She carefully untied the ribbon and began reading, Henry standing quietly beside her, respecting the weight of the moment. The letters told a story far more complicated than either of them had imagined. Grace Ashcombe, Reginald's mother, had indeed promised Eleanor's grandmother a permanent place within the household, grateful beyond words for the lives she had saved during the illness that swept through the village. But the letters revealed something else entirely, a growing friendship between the two women that had blossomed into something the rest of the household staff began to whisper about, a bond that crossed the rigid boundaries of class and status expected during that era. One letter, dated just weeks before the final unfinished note, described how Grace's husband, the previous Duke, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his wife's closeness to a woman he considered beneath their family's station. He had begun making arrangements to send Eleanor's grandmother away, under the guise of a generous severance, hoping to end the friendship before it caused what he called unnecessary talk among their social circle. Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest as she read the words, imagining her grandmother's heartbreak at being forced from a place and a friendship that clearly meant so much to her. She continued reading, discovering that Grace had fought against her husband's decision, pleading with him to honor the promise she had made. But ultimately, the Duke's authority within the household proved absolute. The final letter in the stack, the same one Eleanor had found unfinished in the study, revealed that Grace had planned to leave her husband and follow Eleanor's grandmother from the estate, unwilling to break a promise that meant more to her than social expectations. The letter cut off mid-sentence, exactly as Eleanor had found it before, leaving both women's stories suspended in an unresolved moment, frozen decades in the past. "What happened to her after that?" Henry asked quietly, watching Eleanor's face as she processed everything they had just read. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "My grandmother never spoke about her time working here. She kept only that one photograph and never explained its significance until her final years, when she was too weak to tell the full story before she passed." Henry moved to the wooden box sitting beside the letters and carefully opened its lid. Inside, they found a collection of pressed flowers, carefully preserved between sheets of thin paper, along with a small silver locket. Eleanor lifted the locket gently, opening it to reveal two tiny portraits inside, one of a young woman who closely resembled the photograph she carried, and another of a woman who must have been Grace herself, both smiling warmly at whoever held the camera. They truly cared for each other, Eleanor whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, despite her efforts to remain composed. This wasn't simply gratitude. This was real friendship, maybe something even deeper, and it was torn apart because of pride and old-fashioned expectations. Henry nodded solemnly. That would explain the sudden departure everyone speaks of, and perhaps even the tragedy that struck the family not long after. Grief and regret have a way of poisoning a household from within, long after the original wound has healed on the surface. They spent the rest of the morning carefully documenting everything they found, Eleanor photographing each letter and item, before carefully repacking the trunk to preserve its contents. As they climbed back up the narrow stone staircase toward the hidden passage, Eleanor felt a mixture of grief and determination settling over her. She finally understood why this house had haunted her family for 2 generations, and why Reginald seemed so certain that anyone who stayed too long would eventually break beneath its weight. The house was not cursed by anything supernatural. It was burdened by unfinished grief, a broken promise, and 2 families who had never found closure after everything fell apart. Eleanor resolved that she would be the one to finally bring that closure, no matter how difficult the path ahead might prove. As they emerged from the passage into the second-floor hallway, sealing the panel carefully behind them, Eleanor heard the sound of a car approaching outside. She moved to the nearest window and looked down to see Reginald's black car parked near the broken gate. The Duke himself stepping out and looking up toward the house with an expression she could not quite read from this distance.
"He's here,"
she said to Henry, who joined her at the window with visible unease. "I should go," Henry said quickly. "He won't be pleased to see me involved in this, not after everything that happened between our families." "You don't have to leave," Eleanor said firmly. "This is my house now, and you're helping me restore it. He has no authority here anymore, whatever he might believe." Henry hesitated, clearly torn between old loyalties and his growing trust in Eleanor's mission. But eventually he nodded and followed her down the staircase to meet Reginald at the door. When Eleanor opened it, Reginald's eyes moved briefly to Henry standing behind her, before returning to her face, his expression hardening slightly. "I see you've recruited old allies," Reginald said, his tone carrying an edge she had not heard during their first meeting. "Henry is helping me with repairs," Eleanor replied evenly. "I would think you'd be pleased. Someone with real experience is looking after your family's former home." "I'm not pleased about anything happening on this property," Reginald said. "I came to check on your progress, expecting to find you halfway to leaving already, given how the first night usually goes. Instead, I find you've enlisted help and appear entirely too comfortable for someone who has only been here 2 days. Perhaps your predictions aren't as reliable as you believed," Eleanor said, unable to keep a hint of challenge from her voice. Reginald studied her carefully, something shifting behind his composed expression. "We'll see how comfortable you remain once the real winter arrives," he said, though his words lacked the certainty they had carried at their first meeting. "In the meantime, I would advise caution with whatever renovations you're planning. This house has secrets that are best left undisturbed." Eleanor exchanged a brief glance with Henry before turning back to Reginald. "Funny you should mention secrets," she said carefully, "because I believe I've just found several that concern your own mother rather directly." Reginald's expression froze, the color draining slightly from his face.
"What are you talking about?"
"I think you should come inside," Eleanor said. "There's something you deserve to see, and I believe it's long past time someone showed it to you." Reginald followed Eleanor and Henry inside, his usual composure slipping with every step deeper into the manor. Eleanor led him to the study, where she had laid the letters and the silver locket carefully across the old desk earlier that morning. She watched his face as his eyes fell upon his mother's handwriting, recognition flickering through his controlled expression before he could hide it. "Where did you find these?" he asked quietly, his voice noticeably different from the cold authority he had carried at the door. "Hidden behind a passage on the second floor," Eleanor said, "sealed away in a trunk, along with these letters and a locket containing 2 portraits." Reginald lifted one of the letters with careful hands, reading in silence as Eleanor and Henry watched. His jaw tightened as he progressed through the pages, and when he reached the final unfinished letter, he set it down slowly, staring at the desk, as though the wood itself might offer some explanation for what he had just read. My father never spoke of this, he said finally. I always believed my mother left the household staff issues to him entirely. I never imagined she fought against him, or that she planned to leave. She loved someone enough to risk everything, Eleanor said gently. My grandmother, the woman in that photograph I showed you, would have been that same woman in your mother's locket. Reginald lifted the locket and opened it, studying the two small portraits for a long moment. I remember this, he murmured. I found it once as a child, hidden in my mother's dressing room. She took it from me, and never explained why she cried when she saw it in my hands. I was too young to understand, and by the time I was old enough to ask real questions, she had already passed. What happened to her? Eleanor asked carefully. Grace, I mean. After the letters stop, I don't know what became of her, or whether she ever tried to find my grandmother again. Reginald was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he searched old memories. My mother grew distant after I turned 8 years old, he said slowly. She spent most of her time in this study, writing letters that she never seemed to send. My father grew increasingly frustrated with her, and their marriage became a cold arrangement rather than any kind of partnership. She died when I was 12, and my father closed off this entire wing of the house shortly afterward. I always assumed it was simply grief. Now I wonder if it was something closer to guilt. Henry spoke up quietly from where he stood near the doorway. Your father made the decision to send Eleanor's grandmother away, believing it would end whatever bond had formed between the two women. Instead, it seems he only succeeded in breaking his own wife's heart, and perhaps that broken heart never truly healed. Reginald sank into the chair behind the desk, looking suddenly much younger than his composed exterior usually suggested. This changes everything I believed about my family's history, he said. I grew up hearing vague warnings about this house, about tragedy and misfortune, but no one ever explained the true cause. I simply inherited fear without understanding, the same way my father inherited pride without compassion. Eleanor watched him carefully, feeling something shift in her own understanding of the man standing before her. He was not simply a cold aristocrat protecting an inheritance he no longer wanted. He was someone carrying the weight of a family history he had never fully understood, shaped by loss and silence rather than any real explanation. I need to know what happened to your grandmother after she left this house, Reginald said, looking up at Eleanor with an intensity she had not seen from him before. If my mother truly loved her the way these letters suggest, perhaps there's some way to finally give both of them the closure this house has been denying for decades. I only know pieces of her later life, Eleanor said. She moved to the city, worked as a healer and midwife for many years, and eventually married my grandfather. She kept the photograph and never spoke of Ashcombe Manor until she was dying, when she made me promise to visit this place someday and understand what it meant to her. Then perhaps together we can finish uncovering what neither of us fully understood alone, Reginald said, an unexpected softness entering his voice. Before Eleanor could respond, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the distant hills, drawing all three of their attention toward the study window. Dark clouds had gathered rapidly while they were absorbed in the letters, the sky transforming from pale gray to threatening black in a matter of minutes. That storm is coming in faster than the forecast suggested, Henry said, moving to the window with obvious concern. This looks like it could be the first real winter storm of the season, arriving weeks earlier than usual. Reginald stood quickly, his expression shifting back toward practical concern. Miss Voss, if this storm is as severe as it appears, you cannot stay here alone. The roads will likely become impassable within hours, and this house has no reliable heating source beyond whatever fires you can manage to keep burning. I'm not leaving my own house because of bad weather, Eleanor said firmly, though a flicker of genuine concern crossed her mind as she watched lightning flash across the darkening sky. I'm not suggesting you abandon the property, Reginald said. I'm suggesting we prepare properly before conditions worsen. Henry, do you still remember where the emergency supplies were kept when the household staff managed storms like this? Henry nodded, already moving toward the door. The old storage cellar should still have candles, extra blankets, and dry firewood if it hasn't been disturbed. I'll gather what I can before the rain starts. As Henry hurried off to prepare, Reginald turned back to Eleanor, his expression serious. I know you believe you don't need my help, he said, but I've weathered enough storms in this region to know how quickly they can turn dangerous. Let me stay and assist you through tonight. At least until we're certain the worst has passed. Eleanor hesitated, torn between her instinct for independence and the practical wisdom of accepting help during a potentially serious storm. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, "but this doesn't mean I've suddenly become the fragile woman you predicted at the gate." A faint, genuine smile crossed Reginald's face for the first time since they had met. "No," he agreed. "I don't believe fragile is a word that applies to you at all." The wind began picking up outside, rattling the old windows in their frames as the first heavy raindrops began striking the glass. Eleanor gathered the letters and locket carefully, placing them in a safe drawer within the desk, determined to protect this fragile connection to both their families' pasts through whatever storm lay ahead, in more ways than the weather alone. Together, they moved through the house, securing loose shutters and gathering supplies, working as an unlikely team against the growing fury outside. By the time full darkness fell, the storm had transformed into something far more violent than any of them had anticipated, rain lashing against the manor's stone walls, while thunder shook the very foundations beneath their feet. Eleanor stood at the study window, watching lightning illuminate the wild gardens below, and felt a strange sense of unity settling over the old house. For the first time since her grandmother's photograph had led her to this place, Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like a battleground between two strangers. It felt like the beginning of something neither she nor Reginald had expected to find within these storm-battered walls. By midnight, the storm had grown fierce enough to knock out the small generator Henry had set up earlier in the evening, plunging the manor into complete darkness, except for the fire crackling in the library hearth. Eleanor, Reginald, and Henry gathered close to the flames, wrapped in blankets pulled from the emergency supplies, listening to the wind howl through gaps in the old roof. "This is worse than anything I remember from my childhood here," Reginald admitted, staring into the fire with a troubled expression. "The roads will certainly be blocked by morning. We may be stranded here for several days if the snow follows behind this rain, as it often does this time of year. Then we make the best of it," Eleanor said, though she could not entirely hide the exhaustion creeping into her voice after 2 days of constant activity and revelation. Henry rose to check the fire, adding another log carefully to keep the flames steady through the night. "I'll take the first watch," he offered. "Someone should stay awake to manage the fire and listen for any structural damage from the wind. This old house has weathered storms before, but it's been many years since anyone maintained it properly." Reginald nodded in agreement, though Eleanor could see fatigue weighing on all three of them after the intense revelations of the afternoon, combined with the physical work of storm preparation. She found herself studying Reginald's profile in the firelight, noticing details she had missed during their earlier confrontations, the faint lines of worry around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension even now, hours after learning the truth about his mother. "You never really believed the house was cursed, did you?" Eleanor asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Not truly. You believed something else entirely." Reginald was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I believed my family had done something terrible enough that this house simply refused to let anyone find happiness within its walls afterward," he said. "I didn't have proof, only a feeling that grew stronger every time I tried to return here as an adult. Now I understand that feeling wasn't superstition at all. It was inherited grief, passed down through silence rather than explanation. Grief doesn't have to be permanent," Eleanor said. "Not if someone is finally willing to understand it and let it go." Reginald looked at her then, something vulnerable crossing his usually composed features. "Is that why you really bought this house?" he asked. "Not simply as an investment, but to finish something your grandmother started and never completed?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "I've carried her photograph since I was a child, always wondering what secret it held. When this property appeared at auction, I knew immediately I had to be the one to buy it, whatever the cost or risk involved." "You could have simply asked me for the history," Reginald said, a faint hint of dry humor entering his voice, despite the serious conversation. "It would have saved you a great deal of money at that auction." Eleanor allowed herself a small laugh, the tension of the previous days easing slightly in the warm firelight. "I doubt you would have told a complete stranger the truth about your family's past, especially not before you understood I had any connection to it myself." "Fair point," Reginald conceded, a genuine smile briefly softening his expression. "Though I confess, Watching you outbid my own agent at that auction was rather more entertaining than I expected, even before I understood the reasons behind your determination." They talked quietly through the following hours as the storm raged outside, sharing pieces of their respective childhoods and the ways this house, or the absence of it, had shaped both their lives. Eleanor learned that Reginald had spent most of his adult years managing distant family investments, never quite settling anywhere permanently, always carrying an unexplained restlessness that he now understood stemmed from this unfinished history. Reginald learned that Eleanor had built her business from nothing, working tirelessly, not simply for financial success, but to eventually afford whatever it would take to fulfill her grandmother's final wish, understanding this place her family had never fully explained to her. As dawn approached, and the worst of the storm began to weaken into steady but manageable rain, Henry finally allowed himself to rest, trusting Eleanor and Reginald to manage the fire through the final hours before daylight. Eleanor found herself dozing lightly against the armchair, only to wake and find Reginald had draped an extra blanket over her shoulders sometime during the night, quietly maintaining the fire while she slept. When she opened her eyes fully, he was watching the flames with a thoughtful expression, seemingly unaware she had woken. "Thank you," she said softly, drawing his attention back to her. "It seemed the least I could do," he said, "after doubting your resolve so thoroughly at our first meeting." "You weren't entirely wrong to doubt me," Eleanor admitted. "This house has certainly tested me more than I expected in just a few short days." "And yet here you remain," Reginald said, "stubborn as ever, despite storms, hidden passages, and family secrets buried for decades. I believe I owe you an apology for my earlier certainty that you would flee within a week." "Apology accepted," Eleanor said with a small smile, "though I expect you to help me finish restoring this house properly, now that you understand its true history." Reginald considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I think that would be a fitting way to finally honor what my mother and your grandmother never had the chance to complete themselves," he said. "Perhaps it's time this house stopped being a monument to grief and became something worth remembering for entirely different reasons." By mid-morning, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the estate grounds soaked and littered with fallen branches, though the manor itself had survived the storm with only minor additional damage to an already weakened section of roof. Henry surveyed the exterior carefully, while Eleanor and Reginald cleared debris from the front pathway, working together, with an ease that surprised them both after the tension of their first encounter at the gate. As they worked, Eleanor noticed the villagers beginning to emerge cautiously from Grovewood, checking on their own storm damage, and casting curious glances up toward the manor on the hill. Margaret appeared at the edge of the property later that afternoon, clearly astonished to see Reginald assisting Eleanor with repairs, rather than simply observing from a distance, as he typically had in years past. "Well," Margaret said, approaching with obvious curiosity written across her face, "it seems the village gossip network is going to have quite a lot to discuss this evening." Eleanor exchanged a brief glance with Reginald, both of them aware that whatever understanding had grown between them during the storm would likely become common knowledge throughout Grovewood before nightfall. Neither of them seemed particularly troubled by this realization, focused instead on the considerable work still required to restore the house and uncover the remaining pieces of their family's shared history. As the afternoon light began to fade once more, Eleanor stood at the edge of the property, looking back at the manor, now bathed in warm golden light after the storm's darkness had finally cleared. For the first time since arriving in Grovewood, the house no longer felt like a battleground or a burden to overcome. It felt like the beginning of something both she and Reginald had been searching for, whether they had fully realized it or not, long before that fateful auction had brought them together. Over the following days, Eleanor and Reginald fell into an unexpected rhythm, working alongside Henry to repair the most urgent damage before the winter deepened further. Reginald proved surprisingly capable with practical tasks, a side of him Eleanor had not expected from someone who spent most of his adult life managing distant financial affairs rather than physical labor. He learned quickly under Henry's patient instruction, and the three of them made steady progress clearing debris, patching the damaged roof, and repairing broken windows throughout the main floor. One afternoon, while sorting through additional boxes discovered in the cellar, Eleanor's phone finally caught enough signal to receive a backlog of messages that had been waiting since her arrival. Among them was an urgent email from her business partner in the city, requesting an immediate call regarding a complication with her company's primary investor. Eleanor stepped outside to find better reception, her stomach tightening as she listened to her partner explain the situation. The investor who had originally funded much of Eleanor's business expansion had grown nervous after learning she had spent a significant portion of her personal savings on the manor purchase, fearing this indicated instability in her financial judgment. He was threatening to withdraw his support unless Eleanor could demonstrate the estate purchase was a sound investment rather than an impulsive personal decision. He wants documentation, her partner explained over the crackling connection. Proof that this property has genuine value, renovation plans, projected returns, something concrete he can present to his own board before their next meeting. Eleanor, if we lose his backing, it could seriously damage everything we've built together over the past several years. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of two competing priorities pressing against her chest. She had come to Grovewood to honor her grandmother's memory and uncover a painful family history, never fully considering how deeply this decision might affect the business she had spent so many years building from nothing. "I'll put together what he needs," she told her partner, forcing confidence into her voice, despite the uncertainty churning inside her. "Give me until the end of the week." When she returned inside, Reginald noticed her troubled expression immediately. "Is everything all right?" he asked, setting down the tools he had been using to repair a window frame in the main hallway. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to share, before deciding honesty had served them well so far, in building whatever fragile trust now existed between them. "My primary business investor is threatening to withdraw his support," she explained. "He believes buying this estate was a reckless decision, and he wants proof otherwise before he'll continue backing my company." Reginald's expression grew thoughtful. How serious would the consequences be if he did withdraw his support entirely? "Serious enough to threaten years of work," Eleanor admitted. "My business employs a dozen people who depend on its stability. I can't simply ignore this problem, no matter how much I want to focus entirely on restoring this house." "Then let me help," Reginald offered without hesitation. "I have experience presenting investment proposals, and I understand exactly what skeptical investors need to see documented properly. Between the renovation plans we've already discussed and the historical significance of this property, we can build a compelling case for your investor." Eleanor studied him carefully, surprised by the immediacy of his offer. "Why would you want to help me convince an investor to support this project? A few days ago you were convinced I would fail entirely." "A few days ago, I didn't understand what this house truly represented," Reginald said. "Now that I do, I find myself invested in seeing it properly restored, for reasons beyond simple curiosity about my family's past. Let me help you protect what you've built, Eleanor. It's the least I can offer, after everything you've already given toward understanding what happened here." Grateful despite her instinct toward independence, Eleanor accepted his help, and together they spent the following days compiling detailed documentation of the renovation progress, historical significance, and long-term value the restored estate would represent. Reginald's knowledge of property valuation, combined with Eleanor's business acumen, produced a proposal far stronger than anything Eleanor could have assembled alone in the limited time available. However, complications arose from an entirely unexpected direction. While researching property records to strengthen their documentation, Reginald discovered that a distant cousin, a man named Edmund Ashcombe, had been quietly attempting to challenge the legitimacy of the original auction sale, claiming the estate should have passed to him through an obscure clause in an old family trust that predated Reginald's direct inheritance rights. "I had no idea Edmund still harbored ambitions toward this property," Reginald said grimly, reading through the legal documents that had arrived at his residence and been forwarded to the manor by his assistant. "He's always resented that I inherited the family title, while he received only a modest allowance. This challenge could complicate your ownership significantly. If he manages to convince a court, there's genuine ambiguity in the trust's original language." Eleanor felt fresh anxiety settling into her chest, compounding the pressure she already faced from her business investor. "What exactly does this mean for my ownership of the house?" "It means we likely need proper legal counsel to protect your claim," Reginald said, "and it means Edmund will probably use every resource available to delay or complicate matters, hoping to pressure you into abandoning the property before the challenge can be properly resolved in court." "Why would he do this now?" after the estate has already been sold at public auction. Because he's realized, likely through village gossip, that this property carries more significance than simple real estate value, Reginald said. If he's learned about the historical documents we've uncovered, or the renewed interest in restoring this house, he may see an opportunity worth pursuing that he previously considered not worth the effort. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the mounting complications threatening to derail everything she had worked toward since arriving in Grovewood. Between her business investors' demands and now a legal challenge to her very ownership of the manor, the path forward suddenly seemed far more treacherous than the practical renovation work she had originally anticipated facing. "We'll handle this together," Reginald said, noticing her troubled expression. "I have connections to excellent legal counsel who specialize in exactly these kinds of trust disputes. Edmund's claim is almost certainly weaker than he believes, but we'll need to move quickly and decisively to ensure it doesn't gain unnecessary traction." Henry, who had been listening quietly from where he worked, repairing a nearby doorframe, spoke up with quiet determination. "Whatever help you need from the village, you'll have it," he said. "There are people here who remember exactly what kind of man Edmund's father was, and what kind of empty promises that branch of the family has made before. You won't face this challenge without support." Eleanor felt a swell of gratitude toward both men, recognizing how quickly her circle of allies had grown since her uncertain arrival just a week earlier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing them, a realization that provided unexpected comfort, despite the mounting pressures threatening her fragile hold on both her business and her newfound connection to this house's true history. That evening, as they finalized the investment documentation to send to Eleanor's skeptical backer, Reginald paused before signing his own name, alongside hers, as a co-signatory, demonstrating serious commitment to the property's restoration. "This will make my involvement in your affairs quite public," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "Are you certain you want my name attached to this proposal, given everything Edmund might try to use against us?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, understanding the genuine risk Reginald was offering to share alongside her. "I trust you," she said finally, surprising herself with how easily the words came, after everything they had endured together over the past week. "Whatever challenges come from Edmund, or anyone else, I would rather face them with your support than try to navigate this alone." Reginald signed his name beside hers, sealing not just a business proposal, but an unspoken commitment to face whatever difficulties still lay ahead, as genuine partners in restoring both the estate and the fractured history that had brought them together in the first place. 3 days later, Eleanor received word that Edmund had formally filed his challenge with the local court, requesting an emergency hearing to freeze any further transactions or renovations on the property until ownership could be properly determined. The news arrived just as Eleanor's investor sent a cautiously positive response to their documentation, expressing renewed interest but requesting a follow-up meeting within 2 weeks to finalize continued support. The timing could not have been worse. Eleanor now faced the possibility of losing both her business backing and her legal claim to the manor within the same critical window, a convergence of pressures that threatened to undo everything she had built since arriving in Grovewood. Reginald's lawyer, a sharp and experienced woman named Charlotte Ames, arrived at the manor to review the situation in person. She spread legal documents across the study desk, the same desk where Eleanor had first discovered the letters connecting her grandmother to Grace Ashcombe, and examined everything with careful precision. Edmund's claim relies on a very narrow interpretation of language from a trust document written nearly 60 years ago, Charlotte explained, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the relevant clause. "It's not entirely without merit, but it's also far from certain to succeed. The real danger isn't necessarily losing the case outright. It's the delay this challenge could cause, freezing your ability to complete renovations or secure additional investment while the matter works through the courts." "How long could a case like this take to resolve?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the rising panic from her voice. "Months, potentially longer if Edmund's legal team decides to appeal any unfavorable rulings," Charlotte said. "Given the timeline you've described with your business investor, that kind of delay could prove extremely costly." Reginald paced near the window, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration. "There must be something we can do to expedite this process, or convince Edmund to abandon the claim before it reaches formal proceedings." Charlotte considered this for a moment. "There is one possibility," she said carefully. "If we can demonstrate that Edmund's true motivation isn't a genuine belief in his legal claim, but rather an attempt to profit from the property's rising value, now that renovation and historical interest have increased its worth, we might be able to argue the challenge constitutes bad faith litigation. That could significantly weaken his position and potentially resolve this much faster." "How would we prove something like that?" Eleanor asked. "We would need evidence of his true intentions," Charlotte said. "Correspondence, financial records, anything suggesting he's pursuing this claim purely for monetary gain, rather than any genuine belief in wrongdoing during the original sale." Henry, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up thoughtfully. "Edmund has never shown any interest in this property throughout his entire life," he said. "I worked on these grounds for 20 years, and never once saw him visit, not even during family gatherings, when Reginald and his parents were still in residence. If he suddenly cares so deeply about ownership now, after decades of complete indifference, that timing alone might raise questions worth investigating." "That's a good starting point," Charlotte said, making notes. "Reginald, do you have access to any communications between Edmund and his own financial advisors? Sometimes, these things leave a trail if someone begins investigating property values or renovation costs before formally filing a legal challenge." Reginald nodded slowly. "I can make some inquiries through mutual family connections. It won't be pleasant, given our already strained relationship, but if it helps resolve this situation faster, it's worth pursuing." Over the following days, while Charlotte worked through official legal channels, Reginald quietly reached out to distant relatives and family associates who might have information about Edmund's recent activities. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued preparing for her upcoming investor meeting, torn between anxiety over the legal complications and determination not to let either crisis derail the progress she and Reginald had made together. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through Margaret, who mentioned during a routine grocery visit that a real estate appraiser had been asking questions around Grovewood several weeks before Eleanor's auction purchase, inquiring about the manor's potential value if properly restored. When Eleanor and Reginald investigated further, they discovered the appraiser had been hired directly by Edmund, well before Eleanor had even placed her winning bid at auction. "This proves he was already investigating the property's potential value before you purchased it," Charlotte said triumphantly when Eleanor brought her this new information. "Combined with his complete absence from any involvement with the estate for decades, this strongly suggests his current legal challenge is motivated purely by financial opportunity, rather than any genuine grievance about the trust's original terms." Armed with this evidence, Charlotte requested an emergency conference with Edmund's legal representation, presenting the findings alongside a clear message that pursuing bad faith litigation could result in significant legal consequences and financial penalties if proven in court. Faced with this mounting evidence and the very real risk of expensive countersuit, Edmund's legal team recommended he withdraw the challenge rather than risk a costly and potentially embarrassing public legal battle. 5 days after filing his initial claim, Edmund formally withdrew his challenge, and Eleanor's legal ownership of Ashcombe Manor was fully confirmed without any further complications. Eleanor felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over her as Charlotte delivered the news personally at the manor, though she knew the underlying pressure from her business investor still required careful attention in the coming days. "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely, shaking Charlotte's hand before turning to Reginald with equal gratitude. "I don't know how I would have navigated this without both of your help." "You would have found a way," Reginald said with quiet confidence. "You've proven repeatedly over these past weeks that you're far more resourceful than anyone in Grovewood initially gave you credit for, myself included." With the legal challenge resolved, Eleanor turned her full attention toward preparing for her investor meeting, now scheduled for the following week. Reginald insisted on accompanying her to the city, arguing that his first-hand testimony about the property's genuine historical significance and renovation progress would strengthen her presentation considerably. The night before their departure, Eleanor found herself standing in the now partially restored library, admiring the progress they had made together over these intense weeks since her arrival. New windows had replaced the broken glass, fresh paint-covered walls that had been peeling with neglect, and the fireplace that had once provided their only warmth during the storm now served as a comfortable centerpiece for a room slowly returning to its former dignity. Reginald joined her quietly, following her gaze around the transformed space. "It's remarkable how much has changed in such a short time," he said. "Not just the house, but everything surrounding it." "I couldn't have accomplished any of this without you and Henry," Eleanor said honestly. "When I arrived here, I expected to face this challenge entirely alone." "And now?" Reginald asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity about her answer. Eleanor turned to face him fully, feeling the weight of everything they had shared together over these transformative weeks. "Now I understand that some of the most important discoveries can't be made alone," she said softly. "Whether it's uncovering family history, restoring a broken home, or facing legal and financial challenges, neither of us anticipated when we first met at that gate." Reginald's expression softened into something warmer than she had seen from him, even during their closest moments throughout the storm and subsequent challenges. "I'm grateful for that gate meeting more than I initially let myself admit," he said. "Despite my confident predictions that you would flee within a week, I find myself hoping you'll want to stay considerably longer than that, regardless of how this investor meeting concludes tomorrow." Eleanor felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, understanding the deeper meaning behind them, beyond simple business partnership or historical curiosity. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the city, and whatever the future held for Ashcombe Manor, she knew with growing certainty that she had found something in Grovewood far more valuable than she had ever anticipated when she first raised her paddle at that fateful auction. The drive to the city took nearly 4 hours, winding away from the quiet hills of Grovewood into increasingly busy roads, and eventually, the familiar skyline Eleanor had left behind weeks earlier. She felt strangely disconnected from her old life as they approached the tall glass building where her investors' offices occupied the entire top floor, as though the version of herself who had built this business now belonged to a different chapter entirely. Reginald sat beside her in the car, reviewing his notes one final time before their meeting. "Remember," he said, "the strength of our presentation lies in demonstrating tangible progress alongside genuine historical significance. Investors respond to concrete evidence, not simply passionate conviction, however sincere that conviction might be." "I understand," Eleanor said, though nervousness still churned in her stomach as they parked and made their way into the building's impressive lobby. Her investor, a stern man named Harold Whitfield, greeted them in a conference room overlooking the city skyline, his expression carefully neutral as Eleanor and Reginald began their presentation. Eleanor walked him through the renovation progress, using photographs, documenting the transformation from their arrival to the current state of restoration, while Reginald provided detailed context about the property's historical value and the growing local interest in preserving such significant estates. Harold listened with careful attention, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions about timeline projections, renovation costs, and long-term revenue potential should Eleanor eventually choose to open portions of the restored estate for public tours or historical significance, an idea Eleanor and Reginald had discussed extensively during their preparation. "This is considerably more thorough than I expected," Harold admitted after nearly an hour of detailed discussion. "I'll confess, when I first heard about this purchase, I assumed it represented exactly the kind of impulsive decision that could destabilize your company's otherwise excellent track record. This presentation suggests something quite different, a carefully considered investment with genuine long-term value." Eleanor felt tension easing from her shoulders as Harold's tone shifted from skeptical to cautiously impressed. "I understand your initial concerns," she said, "but I promise you, this property represents both personal significance and genuine business opportunity. I wouldn't have pursued it otherwise, particularly not while managing the responsibilities I already carry toward our existing company operations." Harold studied the documentation once more before finally nodding. "I'm satisfied enough to continue our partnership," he said, "though I'll want quarterly updates on renovation progress and revenue projections going forward, particularly regarding this new historical tourism angle you've proposed." Relief flooded through Eleanor as Harold extended his hand to formalize their continued agreement. As they shook hands, sealing her business partnership's continued security, Eleanor felt the enormous weight of the past weeks finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. After leaving Harold's office, Eleanor and Reginald found a quiet cafe nearby to process the successful outcome before beginning their drive back toward Grovewood. Sitting across from each other in the small cafe, Surrounded by the familiar bustle of city life, Eleanor felt suddenly aware of how much had changed since her uncertain arrival at that auction house weeks earlier. "You handled that beautifully," Reginald said, watching her with obvious admiration. "I've sat through countless investor meetings throughout my career, and few people demonstrate the kind of composed confidence you showed in there today." "I couldn't have prepared such a compelling case without your help," Eleanor said honestly. "Between the historical documentation and your understanding of property valuation, we built something far stronger together than I could have managed alone." Reginald reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently. "I find myself grateful for far more than simply business partnership these days," he said, his voice carrying quiet sincerity. "These past weeks have changed my understanding of so many things, not just about my family's history, but about what genuine connection actually feels like. Something, I confess, I hadn't experienced in longer than I care to admit." Eleanor felt her heart racing at his words, understanding the deeper meaning behind them, despite his characteristically measured delivery. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "When I arrived in Grovewood, I expected to find only answers about my grandmother's past. I never anticipated finding someone who would understand that search so completely, or who would choose to stand beside me through every complication that followed." Their conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's phone buzzing, with an urgent call from Henry, his voice tense and worried when she answered. "Eleanor, you need to come back immediately," he said. "There's been a fire in the east wing of the manor. It's not catastrophic, but it's serious enough that we need your immediate decisions about how to proceed with repairs before further damage occurs." Eleanor's heart dropped as she relayed the news to Reginald, both of them abandoning their coffee and hurrying back toward the car. The successful investor meeting suddenly overshadowed by this new emergency, threatening everything they had worked so hard to restore over the past several weeks. The drive back to Grovewood felt considerably longer than their earlier journey to the city, anxiety building with every passing mile, as Eleanor imagined the potential extent of damage awaiting them. Reginald drove with focused determination, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand reassuringly whenever her worry became visibly overwhelming. "Henry said it's not catastrophic," Reginald reminded her gently, as they finally approached the familiar winding road leading toward the manor. "Whatever damage occurred, we've already proven together that we can handle significant challenges when they arise. This will be no different." As they rounded the final bend in the road, Eleanor could see smoke still lingering faintly above the east wing of the manor, though the flames themselves appeared to have been extinguished already, likely through Henry's quick action, combined with help from villagers who had noticed the smoke and rushed to assist. Margaret's car sat parked near the gate, alongside several other familiar vehicles from Grovewood, evidence of the community rallying together to help protect the estate during this unexpected crisis. Eleanor rushed from the car the moment Reginald parked, hurrying toward the house where Henry met her at the entrance, his face streaked with soot, but his expression relieved rather than devastated. "We managed to contain it before it spread beyond the East Wing storage room," he explained quickly. "It looks like faulty old wiring finally gave out, probably weakened further by the storm damage from last week. The damage is significant in that one section, but the main structure remains sound." Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of relief and continued anxiety as she surveyed the damage herself, seeing the charred remains of what had once been additional storage space, now reduced to blackened wood and melted debris. Yet as she looked around at the gathered villagers who had come to help, people she had known for only a few weeks, but who had clearly grown invested in seeing this restoration succeed, she felt something powerful settling over her despite the setback. This community, this house, and the man standing beside her had become far more important to her than she had ever anticipated when she first arrived in Grovewood with nothing but a photograph and a determination to understand her grandmother's unfinished story. Whatever challenges still remained, whatever repairs this fire damage would require, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people determined to help her see this restoration through to its completion, no matter what obstacles continued to arise along the way. In the days following the fire, the entire village of Grovewood seemed to rally around the manor's restoration in a way Eleanor could never have anticipated when she first arrived as a suspicious outsider. Villagers who had once whispered warnings about the cursed estate now arrived daily with tools, spare materials, and practical assistance, treating the restoration as a shared community project rather than simply one woman's isolated endeavor. Margaret organized a rotation of volunteers to help clear the fire damage, while other villagers Eleanor had barely met before contributed skills ranging from carpentry to electrical work, ensuring the faulty wiring throughout the entire house received proper professional attention rather than risking another dangerous incident. Henry oversaw the coordination with the quiet authority of someone who had waited years for the chance to properly care for this property again. Reginald remained at the manor throughout this period, his presence no longer questioned by villagers who had witnessed his genuine commitment to both the restoration and to Eleanor herself over the preceding weeks. Their partnership, initially born from complicated family history and shared determination to uncover buried truths, had grown into something neither of them had anticipated, but both now embraced without hesitation or doubt. As winter deepened around Grovewood, bringing the first true snowfall to blanket the hills surrounding the estate, the restoration progressed steadily toward completion. The fire-damaged section was fully repaired, modernized with updated electrical systems that finally brought reliable heating throughout the entire house for the first time in over a decade. The gardens, though still dormant beneath the winter snow, had been cleared of years of overgrowth, promising renewed beauty once spring eventually arrived. Eleanor spent her evenings continuing to research her grandmother's history, aided now by resources Reginald provided through his family's remaining connections and archives. Together, they pieced together the fuller story of what had happened after Grace's final unfinished letter, discovering through old parish records that Eleanor's grandmother had eventually settled in a nearby city, never remarrying until many years later, always keeping that single photograph as her only physical connection to the friendship and possibly deeper love she had shared with Grace before circumstances tore them apart. They also discovered, through careful research into old family correspondence, that Grace had continued writing letters to Eleanor's grandmother for several years after her departure, though it remained unclear whether any of these letters were ever actually sent or received, given the strict social constraints of their era and Grace's husband's continued influence over household affairs. Eleanor found herself moved to tears reading Grace's private reflections, understanding now the full weight of love and regret that had shaped both women's remaining years apart from each other. "I think," Eleanor said one evening as she and Reginald sat together in the fully restored library, surrounded by warm firelight and the comfortable silence of a home finally healed from decades of neglect, "that we should create something here to honor both of them properly. Not just restoring the house itself, but establishing something that acknowledges what they meant to each other, and what courage it took for both of them to love so genuinely, despite everything working against them." Reginald considered this thoughtfully, his hand finding hers naturally, as they sat close together near the fire. "I have an idea," he said. "What if we established a small memorial garden, using the space where the old fountain currently sits abandoned? We could restore it properly, and dedicate it to both our grandmothers, ensuring their story becomes part of this house's history, rather than something buried and forgotten within hidden passages." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes at the beauty of his suggestion. "I would love that," she said softly. "It feels like exactly the right way to finally give them the acknowledgement they deserved, but never received during their own lifetimes." Over the following weeks, as winter fully settled over Grovewood, Eleanor and Reginald began planning this memorial garden alongside the continuing restoration efforts throughout the rest of the estate. Henry contributed his considerable knowledge of the original garden layout, helping them design something that honored both the historical beauty of the original grounds and the deeper meaning behind their dedication. As Christmas approached, bringing genuine holiday spirit to the newly welcoming manor for the first time in over a decade, Eleanor found herself reflecting on everything that had changed since that tense afternoon at the auction house weeks earlier. She had arrived in Grovewood, expecting resistance, isolation, and perhaps the difficult task of restoring a physical structure, while uncovering painful family history entirely alone. Instead, she had found a community willing to embrace her once they understood her genuine intentions, a caretaker whose knowledge and loyalty had become invaluable to the restoration's success, and most unexpectedly, a partner in Reginald, whose initial certainty that she would flee within a week had transformed into a deep commitment to build something lasting together, both within these restored walls and in the relationship that had grown steadily stronger through every challenge they faced side by side. On a crisp December evening, with snow falling gently outside the library windows, and the newly restored manor glowing warmly with lights throughout its many windows for the first time in over a decade. Reginald turned to Eleanor, with an expression of quiet certainty she had come to recognize during their months together. "Do you remember what I told you that first evening at the gate?" he asked, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You told me I would plead to return within a week," Eleanor said, returning his smile with genuine warmth. "You were quite confident about it, if I recall correctly." "I was entirely wrong," Reginald admitted, "though I confess, I've never been more grateful to be mistaken about anything in my entire life. This house, which I once believed only capable of breaking people who tried to claim it, has instead become the place where I finally understand what it means to build something real, something worth fighting for, alongside someone equally determined to see it through." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "Eleanor Voss," he said, kneeling before her with the same quiet confidence that had first caught her attention at that auction house months earlier. "You arrived in Grovewood, determined to honor a promise your grandmother never had the chance to complete. Will you help me honor a new promise, one I intend to keep for the rest of our lives together, restoring not just this house, but building a future here worth every challenge we've overcome to reach this moment?" Eleanor felt tears of genuine happiness spilling down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to find words adequate enough to express everything this moment meant, after everything they had endured and discovered together since her arrival before winter had fully claimed the hills of Grovewood. As Reginald slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her fully, the newly restored manor seemed to settle around them with a peaceful stillness it had not known in decades, finally freed from the weight of unfinished promises and buried grief that had haunted its halls for so long. Outside, snow continued falling gently over the memorial garden, taking shape near the restored fountain, a lasting tribute to two women whose love had been denied its proper acknowledgement, now finally honored through the unexpected union of their grandchildren decades later. Ashcombe Manor, once abandoned and feared throughout the entire village, had become exactly what Grace and Eleanor's grandmother had always hoped it might be: a home built on genuine love, courage, and the willingness to fight for what truly mattered, regardless of what obstacles or expectations stood in the way. Eleanor had arrived, determined never to plead for anything, and in the end, she never needed to. She had simply needed to stay, to search, and to trust that some promises, however delayed, were always worth the wait required to see them finally, completely fulfilled.